Thanks, everybody. We're certainly jumping from local to national, international, and back to the local. So I'm just going to speak about some of the considerations that we may have to take into account when we look at impact management in future. And this is certainly looking at it from a local perspective and understanding South African legislation, environmental legislation. And just also, just want to highlight that this is not necessarily the view of the Western Cape government per se, but I think it's a few of my colleagues and I that sat down and just discussed what we think the future will hold. So first of all, just in terms of impact management, I think everybody acknowledged that ELA has been the international, globally, has been the most used instrument for impact management. But I think it's also the tool that has most come into under scrutiny and under pressure. And that's why I think globally also, especially impact assessments have come under scrutiny, and there's many regulatory reforms taking place across the globe, and most of them is actually trying to rationalize impact assessments. And there's a lot of debate currently on the go, is this for the better or for the good? Certainly, most of the focuses are for efficiency meaning time and money spent on impact assessments, whereas a lot of people are concerned that this is eroding the substantive value of EAs, meaning the achieving sustainable outcomes. So I think globally, but especially in South Africa, we've seen a proliferation of instruments being developed. I think Amanda van Reenen have highlighted some of them, be it standards being developed, be it generic environmental management programs, or other protocols being developed as a way of either streamlining the impact assessment process or regulatory processes, or even replacing them. I will speak about that a little bit later. And then in the process, I think, and that's also been a subject of some international debate in the literature, is are we blurring the difference between strategic level assessment and project level assessments? And we can just highlight that a little bit later again. And then I want to highlight the shift from outputs to outcomes and to performance management, the need to do that. If you look at integrated environmental management or impact management for that matter, and we look at the whole cycle, and we look at the system that they're operating under. Let's say that everything above the vertical line is or above the horizontal line is strategic, and everything below is project level. Anything to the left of the line, we talk about planning and implementation, and to the right of the line, planning and implementation, and to the left, monitoring and reporting. Then we've got a depiction of how impact management is happening in South Africa, with the top right being strategic planning and design or assessment. The right bottom is project level assessment and implementation, and bottom left is the more project level monitoring and reporting or compliance monitoring, and at top left, the more strategic level monitoring and reporting. That constitutes a whole system. And if I then add a little bit more information to this, and we can start to see what the different regulatory mechanisms are that we're using. And I especially want to highlight the top right now, and that is environmental implementation plans provided for in legislation, strategic environmental assessments, and for those who are exposed to it, environmental management frameworks. Those all constitute what I term environmental planning. The top right is there for our environmental planning context. And then, very importantly, to the top left, that is environmental performance management. So most of my talk is about those two aspects, environmental planning and environmental performance management, that in a future system, we'll have to get those rights and those two aspects right for it to work. Just environmental planning, what is it? And some of the participants in this conference have been involved in the environment, in the what we call an ELAMS, or the Environmental Impact Assessment and Management Strategy of South Africa. And that strategy, which was a multidisciplinary approach, which involved civil society, state stakeholders, created the future map for impact management in South Africa also. And that reflected on environmental planning as meaning the creation of a strategic environmental context for decision making and environmental performance, which ensures that communities can achieve sustainable outcomes through the wise use of resources, inclusive of land, and in a way that's good for ecosystems and society. Now that is a holistic systems approach. That's what environmental planning is about. And then it goes on to actually say that EIPs, or environmental implementation plans, EMPs, strategic assessments, and EMFs are all environmental planning instruments, very importantly. And we need to take this forward. So just in that, there's also then we have to talk about the issue of tiering. Tiering, and especially because in literature you read the PPP, project plan program approach to tiering. In South Africa, it's more a question of policy. Then you've got strategic level assessments and project level assessments, with policy being something like the medium-term strategic framework, environmental implementation plans, or the EIMS. Strategic assessments being SEAs or EMFs, and then you've got your project level EIAs or other instruments with implementation at the bottom. And also, I think we sometimes confuse assessment with implementation. The implementation is the EMPRs, where you monitor and implementation of the assessment at the project level. But more importantly, also, monitoring, auditing, and reporting is actually supposed to already happen at the policy, strategic assessment levels also. And that's not happening necessarily in South Africa the way that it should be. That's part of the problem. But it's important to understand the steering. Then just another concern, I think, is that there's a difference between the strategic level assessment and project level assessment. And we keep on confusing the two. And we have to understand the relationship between strategic and project level assessment to really be able to understand how we move forward in these two operating together as a whole. Simply put, strategic level, you don't know the where. Strategic level assessment, you don't know the where and the what needs to be developed. But that level of detail you only find at the project level, where you know the where and the what, and in most instances. And you have to understand the role that each, the strategic level and a project level, play in impact assessment or impact management. And I think sometimes we are blurring the differences between the two, or yet don't understand the role that, say, data and information play at these different levels. If we go to the strategic level, what needs to happen? First of all, I believe that law reform is needed to shift our focus to more environmental performance management. And believe it or not a lot of people know that in NEMA section 16, there's already an oversight role of provincial authorities over municipalities. We need to take ownership of this. We need to take ownership of environmental planning playing a role in managing the performance in consultation with and in partnership with municipalities. But I believe that we need law reform to strengthen that relationship. Also, the identification and cascading of objectives from an international to a national, to a provincial, to a local level. If we don't know what the sustainability objectives and targets we want to achieve, we're not going to achieve it. And we certainly have not cascaded that down from provincial to from national to provincial to local. We need to have the objectives, targets, and any indicators to understand that we're actually measuring the right thing and we're actually managing performance for the right things. And then I think that we need to keep on conducting EMFs and SEAs, because that's the way that we do the cascading of objectives down to a local level. These strategic level assessment is incredibly important to achieve appropriate level of theory. At the local level or at the project level, project implementation, planning and implementation level, one of the things is that we need more flexibility in the EIA procedures. Flexibility, and it is about a proper screening mechanism, but that comes with the discretion as a key ingredient of creating flexibility. I think if you talk about any complex system, and we've had a very good idea at a global level this morning of what we talk about. It's nothing different at the local level. We are dealing with complex systems. And for complexity, you need flexibility to implement your governance system. That flexibility also comes with discretion. And we have to talk about how we use discretion and how that sits with a governance system. And I believe there's a problem with the trust in the use of discretion. Also then, we have to be able to fundamentally start to challenge the outcome of projects. We have to be able to measure projects in sustainable outcomes. So we have to, and that is where a strategic context is needed to contextualize an EIA so that you can measure the outcomes of a project against sustainability objectives at a higher level. I think also then rationalizing the development and the use of environmental instruments. I think the knee-jerk reaction in South Africa, because of our lack of flexibility in the EIA dispensation, is that we start to develop a lot of instruments to do away with regulatory approvals or to try to streamline the regulatory process. And I believe that fundamentally we should actually go and have a relook at our impact assessment system, because flexibility will then negate the need for the amount of instruments that we are developing. So environmental planning, the challenge with that is that, first of all, we have to accept that as an environmental sector mandate. There's a lot of arguments to say, but planning doesn't constitute an environmental mandate. Wrong. Environmental planning is very much an environmental mandate, and we have to take ownership of that mandate. And as far as that relates to the development planning mandate, yes, we believe that there is overlap with land use planning versus environmental planning, but that is not a relationship of substitution. In other words, you cannot say, if we do good development planning, we don't need environmental planning. The relationship is rather one of complementarity rather than substitution. Yes, of course, we have to improve on intergovernmental coordination. If you simply look at the local level, for instance, a spatial development framework of a municipality versus an environmental management framework for a municipality, those things need to actually speak in one voice. For instance, from a planning point of view and an environmental point of view, you've got the same definition for sustainability. You've got the same baseline information you use. Yet we sometimes, and most instances, have a total different depiction of what constitutes sustainable development. Our challenge is not something in law. It's rather the human agency challenge. The sectorial arrogance that we have, that we believe that we know better than the other sector. Again, it's a relationship of complementarity. Environmental planning outputs, therefore, must provide a context within which you do project level assessment, not only for the environmental field, but also for other fields, development planning, any other sector for that matter. I'm going to skip on that slide. I want to come back to performance management. Environmental planning, to do better environmental planning is just one thing, thank you. But more importantly, it's how that environmental planning, proper environmental planning, is used to improve on environmental performance. We mustn't just try to negate negative impacts, but we must also see about how can we improve and optimize on positive impacts. If we do that in a way that if our environmental planning frameworks address both, then we're actually starting to make a difference. But unfortunately, we are so stuck in just producing a document, producing an output, and not really looking at its implementation and measuring how we perform against that. And that's why I think a theory of change approach, where you actually say, but what's output, impact you want to achieve, and then work backwards in terms of outcomes, outputs, activities, and inputs, then we will start to achieve what we need to actually achieve. But our focus must be on performance management rather than on simply addressing impacts reactively. An example, and a great example, is actually what is already in the legislation. Let's take the Municipal Systems Act, and that it provides for all EMFs, IDPs, integrated development plans, and spatial development frameworks to have a vision, to set priorities and objectives, strategies and policies of how to give effect to those objectives, action and implementation plans, indicators and targets. Ongoing review of that. It's already in our legislation, and we simply do not use these mechanisms to address it. And this can as easily apply to environmentally sustainable development objectives, because that is part and parcel of duties of a local municipality or municipalities as a whole. So we've got what it takes, and we need to use all of these mechanisms more appropriately. Just a few take-home messages. Simply accept that ELA still remains an important instrument, but we cannot water down its value. And for complexity, and we all, in a complex system, we need flexibility. Flexibility goes with discretion, also the use of discretion. And that's where we need the trust of civil society. And we do not necessarily have that trust in civil society. There's a huge distrust in government. So we believe that you actually need a very strong civil society to actually be partners in governance, especially environmental governance. And I believe that, unfortunately, and maybe you're using the wrong word, but I'm going to use it anyway, civil society has over time become disempowered. I don't find any civil societies taking part in any policy and law reform. In fact, ELA has got incredible experienced people. Nowhere do I see them actually taking part, or very few times do I see them taking part in policy and law reform initiatives. In fact, they should be knocking down the doors of government to say, we want to sit next to you in an advisory capacity for policy and law reform. So it's really time that we need to generate or develop and create a strong civil society that actually keep tabs about what government and the governance system, environmental governance system, that's being put in place. Then the sector as a whole needs to take ownership of environmental planning and performance management. Just acknowledge that ELA is a good tool, but it was never meant to be a standalone tool. It must operate within a strategic context where you can holistically integrate all of the environmental aspects into how we generate a strategic vision for area against which you then measure development outcomes. And then we have to rationalize, but yeah, okay. And then a shift is needed from impact management to actually monitoring and measuring performance, rather than just simply be reactive and continuous improvement. Yeah, thank you.